Um, I'm going to be making a case, and I don't want you to jump out of your seat and strangle me, just to hear me out. I'm going to be making a case for one instance, one area in which uploading norms and making sure that they get downloaded in other countries, especially the countries of the Arab Spring and in the Arab world, should be a very important part of our foreign policy. And that's with respect to constitutions. So far in the Egyptian, the American government has basically made no statement whatsoever about any aspect of the process by which Egypt's constitution, which even Mohammed el-Baradei called a miserable document, has been produced, and that's a really damaging omission. And I'll try to make a case for why I think that is. So we know most of you probably read Frank's column in the Washington Times. President Mohamed Morsi declared last week that none of his actions would be subject to judicial review for their constitutionality, which is the same as establishing a dictatorship. And I guess, the people who didn't, everyone saw that coming, except for, I guess the only people who didn't see it coming work for the government of the United States, right? Interestingly, the U.S. aid packages, IMF, the European Union's huge assistance package. Everyone's sort of going back to the drawing board and asking whether these packages can go forward, or whether they should be making particular demands of the Morsi government, assurances with respect to democratic governance and so forth. But the problem is that they don't have any sort of systematic set of criteria to apply, and that's where U.S. foreign policy really needs to engage in an effort of coordination with partners in the European Union, with other governments, to look at what the obstacles are to progress in the Arab world, not just for the transitional countries of the Arab Spring, but also for the kingdoms, right? And an approach that's like what the United States did with its European partners when the Soviet Union collapsed. And James Baker articulated a set of criteria for the recognition of the post-Soviet states. And these were, very carefully coordinated with the countries of Europe. And those criteria gave the post-Soviet states benchmarks of institutional governance accomplishment that were very important in bringing them sort of into the modern world and in giving their people a chance to progress. And I think that the reason, of the Obama administration's habitual inaction, habitual lack of concern. I mean, they say, the administration is concerned about Mohamed Morsi and stuff, but you don't really see them saying anything besides that. And it's not just the Obama administration's approach, which is just habitually inactive, because I guess he believes that American power is bad, so it's better not to exercise it, right? But it's also the fact that we're stuck within an international norm of non-interference, right? Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter enshrines the principle of non-interference in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a sovereign state. And that principle is no longer really tenable. We know that because in the 21st century, the security and prosperity of every nation is going to depend on the security and prosperity of all nations. That's why the Pentagon is so worried about failing states. That's why a failing state on the other side of the world has become a threat to us here at home. And so the Pentagon, and I was at the Pentagon when the Office of the Undersecretary for Policy was very focused on this effort. The Pentagon went about saying, examining the question of what do you do to ensure that these states around the world have the capacity, the governance capacity, to be effective partners in the war on terror. And it's very interesting because during the 1980s, on the other side of the spectrum, the International Monetary Fund was structuring assistance packages for countries, and their conditions, the conditions on the assistance packages were all macroeconomic policy related, right? Maintain an independent central bank, low inflation, stuff like that. But then it discovered that it discovered that these macroeconomic policies weren't going to prevent countries sliding into major currency crises. And ever since then, it's slowly, the IMF staff has been moving to more structural conditions, right, that sort of slowly, little by little, are examining more closely what are the real preconditions for prosperity and for a country to be able to use these assistance packages effectively, so that they don't, among other things, so that they don't benefit just the elites who happen to control the government. And what I've seen that's been really fascinating to me is sort of a convergence of these efforts. The Pentagon's partnership capacity building analysis with the conditionality at the IMF, with the European Union's conditions for structuring their loans, and that's why I've concluded that U.S. foreign policy really needs to focus on structural governance issues in other countries. And that's why, you would think now with having an anti-American, the eternal battle between the realists and the idealists is what you had going on within the Republican Party. You have the realists who said, it's much better to have a pro-American dictator than an anti-American dictator, especially because, you go through a democratic transition, and what could come out the other end of it could very well be just another anti-American dictator. And they appear to have been vindicated now, right? Although, from Obama's point of view, the fact that Morsi is anti-American may actually be a saving grace, right? Because he's most of all concerned not to have to bear any imperialist guilt. And so I think that, the fact that it was terribly uncomfortable to have a dictator in Egypt that was pro-American, and this is and so when looking at Susan Rice and John Kerry for Secretary of State, recall that this is the kind of person that we're dealing with. People who actually respect you more if you're anti-American. But I think that the idealists still have an important point. I mean, the argument that Senator Rubio and others have made is that the success of democracy matters in these countries because, for a very realist reason, at least in their mind, it matters because if we don't support democratic transitions, if we don't support democratic governance, then the dictators may be on our side, but the people won't be. And eventually the people will get their way, the people will put someone in power who is popular for them, and that person's almost guaranteed to be anti-American. That's an argument that deserves a lot of attention. It deserves a lot of attention because U.S. foreign policy should be consistent on principle, right? I mean, U.S. foreign policy is at its most undignified when we take one approach to Egypt to be on the right side of history, and then when the Bahraini government fires on the crowd, we say nothing. And that's very undignified for a government like the United States. People should understand the principles that that guide our foreign policy, and those principles should be flexible, but at the same time neutral, right? And universal principles. And so I think that the proper focus, I think that the way to square the circle between the realists and the idealist camps on how to approach the Arab Spring is to come up with uniform structural criteria that allow you to tell whether a given state is not just, because it's not just elections, right? We know that it's not just elections. Criteria that allow you to tell whether a given state has laid in place the essential preconditions for security and prosperity for its own people. And we should apply those criteria across the board. I mean, we should be applying them in our relationships with Saudi. We should be making the same demands of governance reform of the Saudis that we should have made of Mubarak during his time, that we should be making of the transitional states who are setting up new governments. And if Egypt says it's none of your business what constitution we draft, we have got to let them know that it very much is our business what constitution they draft, and that their constitution is the gatekeeper for full relations with the West. That it's the gatekeeper for the funds that they're going to get from IMF. Like, the IMF conditions should not be left to IMF staff. IMF conditions should be in law. Congress, I mean, the Foreign Relations Committee, if it wants to do something useful, it should focus a lot of attention on the conditionality that IMF attaches to its loans and make it about governance, because we've learned a lot since the 1990s and the currency crisis of the 1990s. Political economists have come up with some very penetrating ideas and observations about why poor countries remain poor. I'll give you a couple of examples. Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, wrote a great book about 10 or 12 years ago called The Mystery of Capitalism. And his question was, why has globalization benefited so many parts of the world but not others? And his answer is that it's because globalization is not penetrating deeply enough into these societies. He says poor societies have abundant wealth, but it can't move, it can't be efficiently allocated in that process of efficient allocation of human and material resources that is what really produces wealth. And the reason is that people don't have access to property rights. So they don't have access to financing, so they can't mortgage anything. People don't, the inherent risk of transactions is such that nobody will part with their money. And so, transactions, untold numbers of transactions that would show a positive return on investment if these countries had an effective rule of law simply don't happen. That's why poor countries remain poor. And so, when do countries have access to effective property rights? Remember how the Arab Spring began, right? I mean, this guy, I forget what his name was, the Tunisian who set himself on fire, was protesting. I hope Obama keeps this in mind. He set himself on fire because he was so sick of dealing with over-regulation, right? I mean, it wasn't, I want the vote. That's not why he set himself on fire. He set himself on fire because every day he had to deal with police who were hassling him for licenses and stuff like that, and he couldn't do business. All he wanted to do was sell vegetables, and he couldn't sell them. And so what we've learned is that Francis Fukuyama wrote a great book, I think it was 2004, 2005, called State Building or Nation Building or something. And one of the observations that he makes is that, that governments are best when they stick to the things that governments do well and restrict themselves to those things, right? I mean, what you have in states like Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, is states that are involved in every aspect of society and do everything terribly badly, right? So you have, what you have to have is a state of limited scope that sticks to the things it does well, such as guaranteeing property rights, and lets the society be free, right? More recently, a political economist, Asemolu, has talked about how important political participation is, right? A government, when a government is run by elites, it becomes an instrument of extracting wealth from the rest of the population for the benefit of that elite, right? And they give the great example in England. At the end of the 17th century, you had the Glorious Revolution. Up until then, the Crown had granted monopolies to particular favored supporters. And when Parliament seized control of economic policy, the first thing that it did was it eliminated the Crown monopolies, because this class of aristocrats had no interest in monopolies. They wanted to compete. And that political participation by a broad class of people laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. So these elements, political participation by a broadly by the society, governments that are limited in scope and stick to the things that governments do well, and institute economic freedom, and access to property rights. Those are things that are guaranteed by a constitution that is well designed and structured properly. What we have in Egypt is a disaster. The Constituent Assembly was boycotted by all the Christians and secularists. It's been completely dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. It has many of the things that made the Constitution under Mubarak such a mess. And when the Arab Spring, and I'll just leave you with this thought, when the Arab Spring first started, and the Egypt crisis first started, I wrote a piece for National Review called An Inconvenient Sphinx, I think. And what I was asking in that piece is, what is the U.S. position on the, if we're saying that the regime is illegitimate, then what's our position on the Constitution, right? Is it illegitimate because he's violated the Constitution, or is it illegitimate because the Constitution is illegitimate? And we never heard an answer to that question. And that was for me, to my mind, the crucial question. So to sum up, the US needs to really focus on what makes a constitution work properly, and it needs to condition full relations and the benefits of full relations with the United States and the international community on states meeting particular constitutional benchmarks. I think that's a new direction in foreign policy, but it's a very necessary one for us to undertake. With that, I'll take questions.
Mario, thank you. That was most interesting. Let me ask you a quick opening question, if I could. To the extent that the United States has been involved in constitution writing lately, apart from Ruth Bader Ginsburg's suggestion that we use South Africa as a model rather than our own, it has encouraged, I think it's fair to say, the incorporation of Sharia into the constitutions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Is this the sort of structural benchmark that you're looking for, or do you counsel against that?
I think that it's very important to come up with a way to hem in the principle, the constitutionalized principle of Sharia law, because Sharia law sort of stands in conflict with the very principle of democratic nation state, right? I mean, when you have, it's not just, separation of state isn't just something that we throw around because it sounds nice. You know, the Kum Madrasa and the Wahhabi movement, what these people believe is in the identification of political and religious authority, the complete identification of political and religious authority. Well, that precludes, essentially, that precludes real self-government. I mean, when you make religious authorities ultimate constitutional arbiters, you are guaranteeing that people will be forced out of the political process. And we know, as I said, we can demonstrate scientifically with the work of political economists that when you freeze people out of political rights, you guarantee that they're going to be poor. And when you guarantee that they're going to be poor, you guarantee a security problem for everybody. Now, you know, we can't be anti-Islamist, but you got to know that the population of Egypt is 10% Christian, and they're watching, you know, Islam become a state religion, and they're going to be deprived of very important rights, and we should be advocating for them.
Thank you. Ted?
I'm extremely in favor of strong and effective and right-protecting constitutions, but the Soviet Union had a wonderful constitution. Lots of other places, which were miserable dictatorships, have had beautifully drafted constitutions. Is there not something to be said for, of course, looking at the Constitution, but also taking a look over a somewhat longer period at what a state actually does as a criteria for U.S. recognition, aid, et cetera, and not simply stopping with the constitutional issue?
That's why I think the conditions should be structural. That's why I refer to structural benchmarks. That's exactly what I have in mind when I refer to structural benchmarks. You know, it's not just a matter of like Ted says, not a matter of the Constitution being written well. It also has to operate as written, and that again goes back to the question of whether the state has sufficient scope to operate properly, sufficient capacity to operate properly within its scope.
Ted, and then we'll come to you. Sorry, Dan. Excuse me.
The Washington Institute had a program this week about Egypt as well, and they had former Congressman Vin Weber and Greg Craig from the Democrats who had went on a fact-finding mission. And they came back with a whole bunch of recommending conditionality for our aid. The problem is we just have been confronted with a gross violation of every red line we would ever have envisioned putting down, with him taking absolute power unto himself, and there's no talk of implementing a suspension of aid, really, to Egypt. Realistically, when are we ever going to do this? Under what conditions? If we're not going to do it now, when he takes absolute power unto himself, when would we do it?
I mean, under this administration, I think you can frankly be surprised if they do anything at any point. I mean, that's the sort of emerging as the defining characteristic of the administration's foreign policy is inaction and insouciance. And I'll disagree with Shoshana on one point. I take issue and tell me if you agree or disagree. But I was, I was unsurprised but outraged by the fact that the administration again had nothing to say when Egypt and Turkey called the Israeli government a terrorist government. Okay. I mean, because you said that they were good on the operation. I mean, I think that this is, the U.S. government needs to take a stance on these issues, and it needs to make sure that other governments accept the principles that we agree are necessary for a well-ordered world. We should be out in front condemning. Morsi, by the way, Morsi declared the suspension of judicial review like 3 hours after talking to Obama. Right? So it's not just that they do nothing, it's that they might encourage them, it's that we don't know the extent to which the Obama administration is giving people green lights to do stuff like this.
I have to tell you, I think that's exactly what's going on here. If it were just inaction, that would be one thing. It's actually catalyzing some of this. Clay?
Is it, these emerging democracies, is it a case where they don't have the capacity for nuts and bolts democracy? Example, having worked in the Senate for 21 years on staff, there's the nuts and bolts of it. Answering the phone, meeting constituent demands, setting up an office that will effectively, carry out your duties. And if that's the case, could we do a better job by sending former staffers or current staffers, said, look, this is the way you do it. You have office hours, you have meetings. Here's the way you go about doing the nuts and bolts. Are the current institutions doing an adequate job, or are there ways we could do better? Not as an imposition of our system on theirs, but showing them how to run theirs the most effectively and respond to their legitimate constituent needs.
Let me just answer that from a 30,000-foot point of view. Recall that in a lot of these countries, the problem is not what we see in Afghanistan. The problem is not that there's insufficient government, it's that there's too much government, right? And then it functions poorly and is corrupt. And I think that it's very important it's very important for, one thing that's really clear is that countries countries cannot make the transition from poverty to wealth unless they embrace economic freedom and limited government. Now, those principles are under assault in the United States. We just had an election over it, and those principles lost in the United States in this election. So, when you have people that are very sympathetic to socialism in charge of the United States government, it's very difficult to discourage other countries from adopting it. But you've got to know, that socialism, you can debate whether wealth redistribution is just or not, is inherently just or inherently unjust. But you've got to know that socialism and redistribution of wealth is a luxury, and it's a luxury that only rich capitalist countries can afford. If a poor country tries to be socialist and create a dependency society, that country is going to be poor forever. Yeah, and these countries don't have any money to begin with. I mean, part of the reason that the sanctions in Iraq proved so disastrous is that, and why Saddam ultimately benefited from them, is that it threw the entire population into penury and dependence on the government. And that suited him just well, because who's going to rebel against the government when they depend on government rations for food, right? So these dictatorships don't have an interest in an affluent, dynamic population. And that's why it's important to make sure that the principles that we are advancing in foreign policy are free market, not just free trade, but free market principles and economic liberty.
Last question.
You kind of just started on my point. I think the problem is not democracies can be socialistic, control the economy, deny people economic freedom. I mean, without economic liberty, political freedom is meaningless, because if you're dependent on the government or the bureaucracy for your food, clothing, and shelter, you can never be a sovereign individual. And we have plenty of lessons in history where if people had the ability to obtain food, clothing, and shelter independent of whether they had the favor of the government or not, they could be essentially free because people exercise economic freedom on their daily transactional basis. It's almost more than their political freedom. So my question is, should the focus be less on democracy, more on what you said, limited government intrusion in in private business. If you look at Pinochet in Chile versus what the alternatives were in Central and South America, Pinochet was an authoritarian, but most of the people had a relative amount of sovereignty in terms of economic growth, and you had a growing middle class. So I guess to summarize my question, how much should our focus really be on kind of focusing on economic freedom, property rights, so that you get a middle class and a property-owning investor class that has a long-term interest in stability and whatnot, rather than worrying about the structures of the Constitution?
Right. It should be the cardinal focus. But the Constitution, you can't have the things that you can't have economic freedom without a properly designed Constitution, right? And so a Constitution that hems the government in to real limits.
I disagree with that.
I
think if you have I think Pinochet is an example. I mean, you can have whatever you want, but if you have a government that respects private property, doesn't intrude itself in the marketplace, and maybe just says, look, we don't want you protesting on the streets, and we don't want you striking, but other than that, and we don't want you fighting and trying to take over our government, other than that, pretty much do whatever you want and earn your living, go out your daily life. I mean,
we can.
I don't think you need a constitution for that.
This is a debate I'm happy to engage in. I think it's a very important debate. Pinochet was authoritarian. That's not the same as an arbitrary dictatorship. And Pinochet certainly was hemmed in by a constitution that guaranteed property rights. Otherwise, it would have been impossible. The economic progress that you observed in Chile would have been impossible. I mean, constitutions matter. Without a constitution, you can't have rule of law. I mean, and without rule of law, you can't have property rights. And without property rights, first of all, without a constitution, you can't have political participation by the broad society. And you need political participation by the broad society. Otherwise, the governments become captured by elites that turn them into instruments of extraction. And you had that. Just because Pinochet is an authoritarian dictator doesn't mean that nobody's participating in politics in Chile. I mean, you had political participation in politics under Pinochet. But that's an important debate, and I'm willing to engage it. It's an important object. I love it when people advance incisive objections against my ridiculous ideas. But and that's a very incisive one. So thank you for making.
Well, it is a debate that we encourage. And I apologize we can't do more of it today, but appreciate, Mario, very much your participation and your insights into these really thorny issues, and especially the call for our government's attention to them.
So thank you, Frank. Thanks for having me.
We are way over time, and I say this with